If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
In a few short weeks, Missouri legislators will return to Jefferson City to debate a gun bill and legislation implementing a photo ID requirement to vote. And State Representative Stacey Newman plans to be a loud voice against both measures. The Richmond Heights Democrat joins us next on another edition of Politically Speaking.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I think that is fair to
As I
say.
say, hands to kiss and babies to shake. But
I think my record speaks for itself.
That's a really good question.
Hello and welcome to the Politically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Jason Rosenbaum, a reporter with St. Louis Public Radio. Joining me in studio in St. Louis is
colleague Joe Mannies.
And returning to our show for the second time, our very special guest from the wonderful world of Richmond Heights.
State Representative Stacey Newman.
Thank you for joining us. This is kind of a pre-veto session special. We had Senator Paul Wieland the last time to represent the Republican side, and the state representative here will represent the entire Democratic side.
Yeah, we're basically trying to get people who are actually going to be in the middle of stuff during veto session.
Yeah.
And so you thought of me. Thanks a lot.
we thought you would be perfect for this because veto session is going to be, there's a lot of little issues that come up during veto session, but the two big ones are issues that you've been dealing with your entire political career. There's a multifaceted firearms bill, which Joe will explain in a minute, and an implementation for a photo identification requirement. Two issues I know you are very passionate about. So let's get right to it. We'll start with the firearms bill. Joe, do you want to just explain what's in this legislation?
There's a whole bunch of stuff in this legislation. And among other things, it basically gets rid of the permit system for concealed carry so people can carry concealed weapons. And anybody, presumably if you're a felon, somebody catches you with them. But the point is anybody can carry a concealed weapon unless proven otherwise. And it also has a rather controversial stand your ground provision that Representative Newman understands the debate pretty well on both sides. It's basically says that if somebody is on a street or any public place and they feel threatened, they can shoot somebody. And now the backers say there's other provisions in state law to make it clear that you just can't shoot somebody for nothing. You've got some opponents, including Representative Newman, who have said, no, the way this is worded, anybody could shoot somebody. And this came up during the floor debate in the House. There's also some other technical issues dealing with it expands the castle doctrine to people who are in your house, not just the owners, but other people who might be in your house voluntarily. So if somebody breaks in, they could shoot somebody, and they would be have the same freedom that you would have as far as protecting yourself in the house.
Right.
So there's a number. Those are three of the key provisions. I'm probably missing some. Representative Newman is was very involved in the House debate, so you're aware of it. There are veto-proof majorities from the Republicans in both the House and the Senate. The question is whether or not in the Senate side there's a filibuster enough to block it, or if some of the sheriffs and some other groups who have come out against it managed to sway a few senators. I think in the House there were so many, I think it's almost impossible for the Democrats to... am I right?
You're right. Plus there was a few members that were absent. So, yes,
Right.
It's going to be much harder to sustain the veto in the House. And as you said, it was it's a party line vote in the Senate. And therefore, we would need two of the senators to actually either not be there for that vote or to change their vote.
Okay, so did I describe the bill right? Is there any other provisions that you think need to be
along
highlighted?
with along with doing away with the permit requirement to be able to carry your gun concealed. It also does away with the training requirements because the training was what the permit was based on. So therefore, any one of us here could go online here in about 5 minutes, buy as many weapons as we want, as much ammunition as we want with no questions asked, and then we would be able to carry that gun if it fit in our pocket anywhere that conceal and carry is legal. And right now there's specific places, including the legislature. Members of the legislature and their staff can carry concealed weapons in the state capitol. Right now, no one else, just them. So under this new bill, you wouldn't even have to have any training, which is where law enforcement has completely come out in terms of this is the first time in my memory that even the statewide police chiefs have weighed in on a firearm bill along with the Fraternal Order of Police. This is statewide have said that those losing the training and permit requirements actually now makes this very dangerous for law enforcement. Not just the rest of us, but actually law enforcement, because already they're having to approach every situation, whether it be a traffic stop or anything, is that everyone is armed.
Now, I know that Joe followed this debate closer than me, but when we've had people on our show explain why they think this bill was necessary, they say, and I'm paraphrasing here, there shouldn't be any fees or requirements or regulations around what they feel is a constitutional right. You've probably heard all the arguments for this bill. That one, I think, is kind of the genesis of why it came to be. What do you kind of make of that?
Well, if that actually was true, now, of course, you would need a judge to weigh in on the constitutionality of a fee. But, there are plenty of states that require fees and permits and have training requirements. Again, that there's cost involved. So if that argument was really valid, you would have seen a case, you would have seen a judge rule that it's unconstitutional. So that's clearly false. But we go back and forth between that argument about Constitution and your right to defense, which again you already have. And to me, the other side of the coin is the number of fatalities. It goes back to human lives. How many human lives are we willing to trade for your right to protect yourself, which you already have? So, again, we're talking about difference in population centers. The mayors and the chiefs in Kansas City and St. Louis have been adamant, prosecutors, against this in terms of the danger required. And those who are advocating for this bill happen to live in communities where they don't have the population, they don't have the level of violence that we do.
I'm going to play a clip now from Senator Paul Wieland. He's a Republican from Jefferson County, and he is going to talk about the constituent reaction that he has received for this bill.
Overwhelmingly, the number of emails and stuff coming into my office are in favor of doing the override. Okay. Now, I am getting a handful of people that are very passionately opposed to it, but when you look at the numbers, it's like maybe a 60-70 to 1 ratio.
Okay.
I mean,
60 to 70 to 1.
It's huge. I mean, I can only count maybe 5 or 6 people that have contacted me saying, this is a horrible idea. You need to stand with the governor. Mm-hmm. But we probably have 500 emails maybe already.
Now, there's a reason I picked that clip because he talked a lot about this bill, is that I have noticed the NRA has gotten involved and they are having a very public campaign to try to get this overridden, which may explain partially why Senator Wieland got so many pro-Senate Bill 656, which is the number that he mentioned in this clip. I'm not sure if that's going to make a difference for people in heavily Democratic districts like you or many of your other Democratic colleagues, but for people who are in swing districts where it may matter, it could. What do you kind of make of that?
Well, when people talk about, they've gotten a ratio of emails, I mean, that to me, that's false polling. I get a rash of emails. I might get, probably more that are progressive Democrats than those that are more conservative, just because of my district. And yet, though, I'm in a more populated area, too, than some of these. where gun violence is a reality. I mean, all kinds of gun violence, from domestic violence to suicide to accidental shootings with little kids pulling the weapon or pulling the trigger. Gun violence is actually very real. And of course, in Senator Whelan's district, he's seeing less gun violence. And he's also actually ignoring, if you want to talk about public opinion, then let's go to the polling that's been done over and over in Missouri that says over 80% of Missourians want universal background checks on every gun sale. No, so if he's going to legislate and determine his vote based on polling, which again, emails coming in is really a type of unofficial polling, then his argument doesn't ring true. He is not addressing the idea that this bill will surely cost lives. Law enforcement has said it. We know this in terms of other states that have passed stand your ground measures. We know from Florida, particularly, since that law went into effect, their rates have skyrocketed. So if he's gonna base his vote on popular opinion, which again, getting a few emails is, then I would think that he would also, by that same theory, be in favor of universal background checks.
Well, the contention he was saying was that criminals are going to get guns no matter what. And he says all these rules and regulations and training and everything simply affect the law-abiding people who wouldn't be breaking the law anyway, and that it was unfair to burden them with all these restrictions when criminals weren't going to be dealing with it. How do you counter something like that?
Because I'm sure he's not the only Republican making that argument.
Well, yeah, these are common arguments that we hear. I would counter with, then why are we making any laws? As a legislator, I'm completely wasting my time if people who, those criminals are just going to go out and break them. So I don't know why I should be wasting my time even going to veto session if that's the case.
That's a good point.
But at the same time, when we've got, like I said, law enforcement, domestic violence advocates, we've got the medical community, we have got everyone who actually deals and is affected by gun violence. And again, in terms of population, you're going to see that more in our urban, suburban, centers just because of population. So his argument in terms of, criminals are always going to break the law. Well, you're really not a criminal until you shoot somebody. Just because in our state, we have one of the few states of the, few lax gun laws in the country. So anyone can get a weapon. I can do it without a background check, and I'm not a felon until I shoot you. So if there's a way to prevent me from, killing someone, I would think that, as a decent legislature, that's what we should be doing. We should be, working with our medical community, working with law enforcement. We should be saving lives instead of making it easier for people to have access to weapons.
What's your sense of what's going to happen?
Well, number one, my first sense is I'm hoping that I actually get to speak on the floor. The last 2 days of session, I was prevented by the speaker from even representing my district and being part of the debate. So number one, I hope that I'm able to participate in terms of, arguing against these measures, or I guess for the veto. But in terms of the actual votes, it's going to be really, really hard, I think, for us to actually, sustain the vetoes.
I want to talk more of a long-term question, because the reason we've been having this discussion is the governor vetoed this bill, just as he vetoed the quote-unquote gun nullification bill a few years ago. And while I'm sure that there are bills that Governor Nixon has signed which you don't agree with, he's obviously picked and choose which firearm bills he wants to be in law and which to veto, and he's not afraid to, take the heat, so to speak. I'm going to play a clip now from Attorney General Chris Koster, who is your nominee for your party, and
for governor.
And he has been endorsed by the NRA in the past in 2012 when he ran against Ed Martin. And I asked him at a recent campaign stop whether he would be acceptable or proud to receive that endorsement against Republican Eric Greitens in the governor's race. Here's his full answer. So it's very possible you may get the endorsement over him. Would that be something you'd be proud of?
I would look forward to receiving the endorsement. I'm trying to build a big tent party here, and I'm trying to bring this state together. And as I've said in many places, rural Missouri wants to see small and conservative government, small and fiscally conservative government. They want individual rights respected, including the Second Amendment. But then they want what everybody else wants in this state, which is they want schools funded, they want roads fixed, and they want health care to stop shutting its doors and leaving their communities. That is a group of principles that I feel comfortable around, and there is going to be debate and back and forth in the Democratic Party around that, but that is where I am. And maybe for a different time would bring a different leader, but in this time, this is the path that I will walk.
Now, one thing I want to say, a couple years ago, I think during the gun nullification, this bill that was going to nullify federal gun laws and some other stuff, Koster did come out against it, and right after a lot of the big law enforcement groups did as well. On this one, he's been pretty quiet, unless I've missed something.
And I also want to point out, because I wrote about that extensively, the NRA was completely silent on that bill, and that silence, I think, was purposeful, because I don't think they actually supported it. That's my theory. You've probably heard something similar.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is this time, it looks like Koster isn't going to say anything, even if he may or may not have objections to certain provisions. Have you, or, because you're pretty active in the state party, have there been discussions about this? Are you comfortable with this as far as Koster stands versus yours?
Well, number one, I totally disagree with the Attorney General. I've been, at odds with the gun lobby, for the past 16 years. And I believe I actually agree with the law enforcement and prosecutors and, like I mentioned, physicians, and I can just go down the road in terms of all the people that believe that we have got to find ways to stop the gun violence that we already have. And again, it's more than just what people want to call, drive-by urban violence. This is domestic violence. This is, mass shootings. This is in schools. This is suicides. This is little kids pulling the trigger because guns are available in their home. There's all of these things, and they go back to human lives. And I just work with too many survivors around the country who are now my close friends, who have taken up this same fight because they do not want this to happen to other people. And so I look at this issue, this is more than a political argument. This is more than just, a bill that we bring up in presidential election years. Right. And this is really about human life. And if the gun lobby, NRA, Attorney General, whoever wants to be at the table and say, okay, yes, we've sold enough weapons, the gun industry is doing just fine. What can we do together to actually save these lives? And, we ask, you mentioned being involved in the party. I was at the, in the national convention here in Philadelphia. Mayor Sly James spoke to the Missouri delegation, and he actually, again, this was a statewide delegation. People from all of our congressional districts were there. And he actually gave the strongest speech I have heard on gun violence in Kansas City. Mm-hmm. And it is his responsibility as our own mayor and chiefs and prosecutors to keep people alive. And I understand the frustration. I understand the being political in certain parts of the state. But I want to remind people there's gun violence everywhere. And it affects all of us, and it might have to affect all of us.
Well, there's a reason, though, why I brought this up. Because, yes, there is the political component. But I think there's a policy effect of somebody getting endorsed by the NRA. If they want to keep that endorsement for re-election, they're basically going to have to conform to what the group or the members believe. And it seems like that means if Koster becomes governor, first of all, any restrictions on firearms that you or your colleagues propose are just not going to become law if he vetoes them. Or two, if the legislature puts forward even more extensions that we see right now, the chances are pretty high he's going to sign it. I mean, those have to be concerns to you.
Oh, I'm extremely concerned. I'm extremely disappointed, and I'm fearful. I actually am, because what this bill that we're facing veto session, let alone, any type of, what we're going to see next year and the year after, is really about, it's going to cause more loss of life to gun violence, because no one is talking about those simple things that came down from the National White House Gun Violence Initiative, things that 80% of Missourians agree with, like universal background checks. Let's make sure everyone who is, buying a weapon should have one, because we know there are certain people that shouldn't.
And just to be fair, because I want to make this clear, if Eric Greitens becomes governor, I think the same scenario is going to unfold, because I think that he and Koster have very similar views. So I'm not just trying to single out Koster on guns, but I just want to make it clear, like, I'm using Koster as an example because it's going to be pretty much the same scenario even if the Democrat wins. But I do want to move on, because the other thing that we're going to be talking about in veto session is a photo identification requirement for voting. Now, as we've said in previous shows, there's a constitutional amendment on the ballot that would authorize the statutory bill that is kind of at play here. I'm sure there's going to be litigation to try to knock down these things. Maybe not. I don't know. But Joe, before we get into the nitty-gritty, could you just kind of explain what the implementation bill does?
Okay, what the implementation bill does is set out exactly what forms of identification would be allowed at the polls. They would have to have a photo ID, but it's not just any photo ID. It's a government-issued photo ID. So it basically limits it to just a few types. They're talking about driver's licenses. They're talking about passports. They're talking about military licenses. And there's been some talk about, like, congressional or, government, if there's a photo, and it has to have an expiration date. And so because that issue has come up before. Unless things change, some states allow student IDs. This one does not. Some allow let's say homeowners association IDs. This one does not. So this only allows about 3 or 4 types of photo IDs. And what it does do, though, there had been some contention, because in order to get these IDs, you have to get your birth certificates. And in many cases, older people don't have a birth certificate because they were born at home. Or if people have lost it or whatever, they have to apply to the health department where they were born to get it. And so in many cases, you have to pay a fee, $15, $20, $30. So there had been a contention this was really a poll tax. So this does have a provision that would pay for those kinds of things. Now, how that mechanism would work is unclear. But the result is that there are some provisions in it. There's also one that would still allow people, if they show up at the polls without an ID, they could cast a provisional ballot. And there seems to be some sort of wiggle room, possibly, on whether or not if they're recognized by the poll workers. So there are some who have said that this implementation bill is a little more friendlier to Democratic concerns than previous ones that Governor Nixon has vetoed. I'm interested in your take on this particular version, because I've heard some Democrats privately say, well, this one may be the best we can get. I'm just interested in your thoughts on this.
Well, first of all, you explained it very well, and it is a two-parter. On its face, if this bill is becomes law, on its face, it's unconstitutional.
Right.
Because back in 2006, a similar photo ID bill was sent to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court ruled in 2006 that it's unconstitutional based on our right of suffrage in our Missouri state constitution.
That's why we have this
right,
proposed amendment on
6,
the ballot.
Right. So first of all, whatever we're doing with this bill here is unconstitutional on its face until we actually, if voters decide to change the Constitution.
Very important detail, but
definitely.
Continue.
So right now, and also it's nice to know that our state constitution has a much stronger right of suffrage. even stronger than the U.S. Constitution, which again, like you mentioned, in the previous case, the Supreme Court did say that those underlying documents, which, we passed after 9/11 because anybody was getting driver's licenses, it's much more stringent and that costs money. If you've changed your name, you have to go and get, bring in that original documentation from your marriage or divorce decree, whatever. So those are all like the stuff in the weeds. But then the major issue is this is not needed. There is no purpose for us to be changing the rules to require a state-issued, photo ID in order to vote. No one has come up with why do we need to do this. On its face, this bill would cost, for the first year, $17 million just in the state. Again, like you said, there's nothing written in the bill like how do people actually get their costs covered. There's no mechanism. So it's confusing. Do you need it? Do you not need it? Why all of a sudden do we have to have this in order to vote? There's no answers.
Now, I want to just mention to our listeners, we're recording this on Wednesday, and this is going to be posted on Tuesday. So we're not going to get into super specific depth on this particular case because it might change. But I do know from today, because what I'm talking about is the Bruce Franks Penny Hubbard situation with absentee ballots. I have already seen Republicans use that as an argument for photo ID. But as Joe has mentioned many times, there is nothing in this bill that deals with absentee balloting. And there's nothing, I think, in the constitutional amendment that deals with absentee balloting.
No, absolutely nothing. So none of this would affect this court fight or previous ones. I mean, frankly, fights over absentee ballots, accusations of absentee ballot fraud goes back, just from my career, I recall covering that in the 70s. So this is not new. The fact that there's a fight over whether or not there was fraudulent absentee ballots cast or pressure on people to vote a certain way with their absentee ballots. But the issue is pass this law, pass the constitutional amendment, and I'm not saying you should or shouldn't, but I'm just saying it will not deal with absentee ballots at all.
Exactly, because as you all know, the election statutes, that whole chapter is quite huge. It's like saying that, stealing cars is the same thing as shooting someone. Well, it's totally different. We have, our election chapter is huge. And again, absentee ballots and those regulations and who gets, how you get the application and what you have to do has nothing to do with in-person voting. Now, in-person voting, like say going back to requiring a photo ID, is all based on the theory that there is in-person election day fraud. However, no cases have ever surfaced. And, Republicans around the country, Republican leaders have said over and over that this voter ID proposal is designed to actually suppress certain people from voting. We know that the elderly, the disabled, like you mentioned, out-of-state college students who do not have a Missouri driver's license and no reason to get one while they're here. We talk about transgender, low-income people who live, in urban settings, don't need to have a car if you use public transportation. There's a whole segment of population that may be affected with voter ID. And again, there's no reason to change the rules.
Now, the implementation bill, and I think the constitutional amendment as well, proposal, does stipulate that, they estimate how much it's going to cost state government to implement this.
The first year.
The first year. But my point is if the money isn't allocated, it can't be put into effect.
Exactly, because
the implementation bill
separately.
Yeah, in the implementation bill, it makes clear.
Well, here's the other thing to remember. First, to make this bill that we're talking about a veto session, to make it even legal, then voters would have to amend our Constitution to allow it, number one, which won't happen until November, or their chance to. So if the Constitution is changed to allow voter ID, just remember, the legislature can come back at any time and alter how a photo ID proposal would work. So those that say, well, the bill that we got this year, there's some compromise in it, they say they're going to help people with the underlying documents, even though there's no way to do it, et cetera, et cetera. To me, that's phony, because they could come back next January and totally change if you have enough votes, you can,
but wouldn't there
change it.
Yeah, but might there be legal fights if they did that, as far as tossing out the state payments to cover for these?
Well, like you said, we would
IDs.
have to appropriate that cost. You tell me which program you want us to take $17 million from. That's just an estimated cost. And then, again, we would have to set up a program somehow to actually make sure that people could turn in those underlying documents and get reimbursed. Right now, there's no way for them to do it. So, again, we're throwing all these numbers around. What we do know is there's about 220,000 current voters, people who are already voters, who do not have a state-issued driver's or non-driver's license. Those 220,000, if this was, number one, to become constitutional and become law, would no longer be able to vote for no other reason than Republican Party, which has been a partisan issue around the country, decided to change the rules.
And going quickly back to the absentee ballot situation, we're looking forward to 2017. After what has occurred in the Frank Hubbard situation, especially the fact that because of a judge's decision, absentee ballot applications are now public record, as well as maybe making absentee balloting less stringent, maybe making no excuse absentee balloting. Those things have been discussed. As someone who has been in a challenging election before and who studies election law very closely, do you see legislative action coming from that situation that A, may make it harder for absentee ballot applications to become public, or B, maybe making it easier for people to vote absentee based off that situation?
Sure, because we've already seen those efforts to restrict certain people from being able to vote. This would be just, the next step. But I've been the ranking Democrat on House Elections Committee. I'll be going now into my 8th year. On that, I expect to be on that committee once again. We'll have a new chair. And usually when we see our first bills that are filed are usually because of a current situation or something that's popular. Let's come in and let's try to fix something. A lot of times we try to do that because we have municipal elections coming up in March and April that, if there's something that really needs to be fixed, those kind of our deadlines. So, sure, I would expect, I don't know what it would be because we obviously don't know yet from this situation what happened or what was wrong, what was right. We don't know.
I mentioned the absentee ballot applications being public records because I could see the argument for them remaining public records because we just had a Post-Dispatch story that used that and uncovered a whole lot of things. The other side, though, is if you have a close election and they're a public record and people are able to find out who voted in the Democratic primary and where they live, I could see a scenario where people on one side are going to people and potentially harassing them into saying they voted absentee for the wrong reason. Have you heard that type of argument? Because I've certainly heard that argument from a lot of pro-Hubbard people and anti-Hubbard people.
Well, I would think that could be possible depending on the type of campaign that's run. But people should know, too, that your voter record is public record. We don't know how you voted. We know that you voted. Which is really how we all start with in terms of we only deal with frequent voters since we don't have campaign time to reach everyone. So, on that argument, and people don't know that right now your voter record is public. I have your name and address if you were a registered voter.
Yeah, it just doesn't state which party in the primary, but that could change.
But I also know, yes, when you last voted and how often you voted, those kind of things. So, again, on an absentee ballot, we're kind of going in some new territory here. And I'm going to have to wait to see what comes out of everything.
Now, Republicans traditionally have not gone after absentee ballots. And one of the reasons is, and I'm going to get some Republicans mad at me, but it's because absentee ballots are used a lot in rural Missouri. They're used a lot because in many cases people live long distances from where they can vote. So they either vote when they're in town. There's things they do in order to get, or they vote by mail. They send in their application. So my point is there have been some estimates. Secretary of State Robin Carnahan did a study several years ago when she was in office, and it was roughly equal, the number of Democratic and Republican votes that were from absentees. So So the estimation was that probably in a general election, it was roughly equal as well. Well, because of that, some have contended that's why Republicans, while they blast voter fraud, have not gone after absentee ballots because it's used a lot by their constituents.
Well, and
too.
There's different programs. I think we're seeing here talk about a disabled elderly program that once you're in it, you are, and you voted. I know there's some stipulation you have to vote once or twice. Or I think even an absentee ballot, you have to vote in person the first time you vote, so you actually know that you're real. And after that, so these elderly disabled can also join this program where they automatically, every election, get that ballot mailed to them. They don't have to go through the two-step with the application. But we have tried. One of my Democrat members has tried for a couple of years just to pass no excuse. Absentee voting, whether you're voting by mail or voting in person, because if you do look at those, excuses that are on the absentee ballot, again, whether you're voting at the election board or by mail, it doesn't cover everything. The biggest thing is, do you expect not to be in your district on election day? And many people have to say, I don't know, particularly if your job is fluid or medical reasons or all kinds of things. And so we have asked, can we just make that no excuse? Because like you said, this is not a partisan issue in terms of voting early. People need to do it. We've also tried to advance early voting, let the voting process start a couple of days earlier, so those people who do need to vote absentee can actually do that in person. And again, we've stalled there. So it looks real clearly that there's no efforts to actually make voting easier, but with these voter ID proposals, it's to make voting harder from our majority party. So it's going to be really interesting to see what we talk about in terms of the our election committee, in terms of what comes out of this situation here with this with this race. But at the same time, to jump real quickly and to make an unknown situation partisan, or to make it blame the Secretary of State, or to do all of this, to me this is kind of childish. We first need to find out what the facts and the details are, and then if a statute needs to be fixed, or if we need to, whatever we need to do, that's what we need to do at that point.
Now, before we go into politics, do you think that the implementation bill will be overridden?
I mean, yeah, the veto of the implementation bill.
Right. And I know you keep calling it implementation bill, yes, and that's kind of, you have to think about, yes. As a partisan issue, not just in Missouri, around the country, and, Democrats being in the super minority in both the House and the Senate, it's pretty easy to predict that, yes, it will be overridden.
But it'll be up to voters to decide whether it becomes law. Because
it becomes constitutional, because right now, it can't become law because it's illegal.
Yeah, I admittingly said that in a very shorthand way. When I say it becomes law, it will technically become law, but if the Constitution amendment doesn't pass, it's automatically unconstitutional, and it'll be thrown out in a second. Because we already know it.
Because we know this bill right now on its face is unconstitutional.
So let's kind of delve into politics a little bit. Joe, we'll go there.
Here. Yeah, now you're also active in the local Hillary Clinton effort. Ran into you at the grand opening of the office just a few blocks from here. I've been covering a lot of the different statewide races from Senate on down, and one of the Republican hopes, and this was expressed even in Cleveland, was that their hope is that Donald Trump is really going to help whip up turnout among the base, or among people, blue-collar, working-class men in particular, who often have not necessarily voted. And so they're thinking that this could actually help their candidates from Roy Blunt on down. I'm interested in your take. As I said, the Republicans are hoping that Trump carries the state by possibly double digits. The polls recently have shown it much closer than that. I'm just interested in your take on how, does Clinton have similar coattails, or is it either pro-Trump or anti-Trump? Just interested in your thoughts.
Well, what I'm seeing is definitely pro or anti-Trump, but at the same time, I'm concerned, not just as a citizen, but as a legislator. So many of the, policies that Donald Trump is running on actually scare me in terms of, we're seeing this week this real big push with Mexico, the anti-immigration, kick in terms of, and what I've seen in the legislature, that anti-immigration, movement is kind of tampered down, which to me is really based on hatred. It's based on racism. It's based on bigotry. Immigration has not been a big issue in our state, and yet we're seeing some of these issues rise to the top. So I worry what his campaign, Donald Trump's campaign, actually represents, what we're going to see in terms of how people vote. Do they believe in his bigotry and his racism and sexism and all of these things that most of us find really, really ugly and do not want in the White House? So when you say coattails, I'm concerned about those attitudes. Those attitudes will stay whether, people win or lose, and they're going to have some long-term effects, I believe, in the legislature.
How energized are local Democrats? I mean, because one of the problem is if you're not excited about your candidate, and I've heard you hear various things about whether people are excited about Clinton or not, or if it's, as you referenced, a big anti-Trump movement. What are you hearing, though, in Democratic circles in your district, which is overwhelmingly Democratic? Just what are you hearing? Are people energized to vote for her and not for him? Or, are the Sanders people coming over? What are you hearing? Well,
I think it's still, you hear that the general election really doesn't begin until Labor Day. And right here in Missouri, since we've got veto session, that comes on the heels of Labor Day. So we have all these things to kind of get through, I think, before people turn their complete attention back to the general election. We know that latest polling shows that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are almost neck and neck in Missouri, which is kind of new for Missouri. I was on the John Kerry staff or campaign back in 2004. We were never up, in that race, and then after that we've lost the status of being a battleground state. We're back to current polling shows us we're almost even, which means that more people are favoring the Democrat presidential nominee, in the last, 12 years?
Yeah.
This is kind of new. So a lot depends, I think, on what happens with, Donald Trump's campaign, what's going to happen in the next 2 months.
Debates. The fact that Washington University here in St. Louis will be hosting the second debate.
Hopefully.
Well, let's not get into that. But
Donald Trump actually shows up, but continue.
Right. Well, we're trusting that he will. My point being is that the debates often are yet another reset button, once the debate season starts.
Well, and we always hear about the October surprise. Maybe that's it. Maybe that debate is it.
WikiLeaks.
Who knows? But
I don't mean to be too conspiratorial, but when he was complaining about the debates coinciding with football, it did plant the seed in my mind that he may not actually go through with it. Football might be a
little more important to him.
Continue.
Right. But I think, we've always seen, who can predict going back the last, several hot presidential, races, what happens in those last 2 months? This is something I do know. We will see another mass shooting in the states. We've had too many. There will be more. If we have now I call it the plane crash theory. The fatalities have to be a higher and higher number for people to, pay attention, to be affected. We will be seeing more of those, and whatever effect that has on voters in terms of, Hillary Clinton running for gun violence prevention, Donald Trump, again telling everyone they need to be armed. There's so many things that can happen in these next 2 months after Labor Day, and what that does to energize voters. It's going to be hard to say. I think right now people really believe that Donald Trump is the wrong person to be sitting in the White House.
Well, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much for coming. This is our first time in person. The last time we did it through the magic of radio in Jefferson City.
Yes, I like being in person better.
I like doing
kind of fun.
I like doing it in person better as well.
I like seeing what you guys really look like all the time.
Too bad.
We are actual people, not holograms. For all of our stories, stlpublicradio.org. Follow me on Twitter at @JRosenbaum. Follow Joe on Twitter at
@JMannies. That's JMannies.
And how would we follow you on Twitter?
He's Stacey Newman, STACEYNEWMAN, Facebook, Twitter. I'm pretty active. I live tweet the session and committee hearings when I can. And thank you very much for having me on. Go veto session.
All right, go veto session. We'll be back some other time. Until then, so long.
I need a camera to my eye, reminding which lies that I've been hiding, which shackles belong.
The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer, St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on the Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.